Hi, welcome to the Bordas Bordas Legal Review. I'm Jamie Bordas. Each week we discuss relevant legal topics here in the Ohio Valley and throughout the state of West Virginia with a guest on the show. Today's guest is Tom Burgoyne, former longtime FBI agent here in the Wheeling area, two-time sheriff in Ohio County, and is now running for re-election, actually, for sheriff here in Ohio County. Tom, thanks for being on the show today.
Jamie, it's a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to be with you and up here at West Liberty University.
Well, thanks. You have had a long and varied career in law enforcement. And the last couple of weeks we've talked about areas of the civil law, and your area of the law is more the criminal area of the law. And
it's the fun part of the law, Jamie.
It is. It's interesting.
Yeah.
You know, even when I was in law school, it was one of my favorite areas. Even though I didn't actually go on to practice in criminal law, I got the award for best student in complex criminal litigation because I enjoyed it so much. I really got into it, but. It is fascinating, and people follow it a lot. Through the years with some of the more famous trials that they've seen on TV, like the OJ trials and things like that. But you actually aren't a Wheeling native originally. You came here because you wanted to back in the '60s. How'd you end up in this area?
Well, I came. Of course, I started with the FBI right out of college at age 22, and after finishing up at the FBI Academy, I was assigned to Miami. And spent 13 months down there on the fugitive squad, and that was very exciting for a young FBI agent. I was then transferred to Pittsburgh, and I'd heard about Wheeling, West Virginia through another agent. He said, if you ever get a chance to go to Wheeling, he was a graduate of Wheeling Jesuit University, and he said, if you ever get a chance to go to Wheeling, please do so. An opening occurred while I was in Pittsburgh. I came to Wheeling single, met a young lady here in Wheeling, and the rest is history. I spent 27 years of my career here in the Wheeling office.
Of course, your wife, Kathy, former Kathy Oliver, is a lifelong resident of Wheeling, and she
Wheeling Central grad, where you are one of the football coaches.
Right.
There.
Yeah, and I've enjoyed getting to know your wife, and you talk about the Wheeling in the '60s when you first came here compared to today now in 2012. Very different in terms of the crime activity and the things that we may see, and of course the population's different. But what was it like back in the '60s to come into Wheeling, and what was the job like?
We were very active. Of course, the job of the FBI has changed a lot since the '60s till the current time. I arrived in Wheeling in '67. 2 days after an organization headed up by Paul Hankish stole a beer truck in Huntington, West Virginia, came interstate through Ohio and back into Wheeling and unloaded the beer in East Wheeling, and I didn't even know where the police station was when I got here. And the other two agents were out of town that day, so I was being led around by a state cop showing me where 16th Street was, where the Wheeling Police Department was, where the Ohio County Sheriff's Office was. And of course, that was my first exposure to Paul Hankish. And that was a lifelong pursuit. He was a very cute criminal, if you would want to use that word. He was involved in many different kinds of crime, and it took us a long time. The U.S. Attorney, through Bill Calabash and our efforts and other law enforcement agencies, indicted him in 1989, and he went to trial in 1990. He was charged with 218 felonies. Ranging over a long period of time. He was charged from a legal standpoint with that RICO statute, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which the government uses against organized crime. And he was sentenced mid-trial. He gave up, pled guilty when he heard the preponderance of evidence that was coming in against him, and was sentenced to 35 years in prison, and he passed away in prison in the late 1990s. But that was basically a lifelong pursuit of mine.
You mentioned former U.S. Attorney Bill Calabash. He did a fantastic job when he was in the U.S. Attorney's office. But
exactly.
What's the relationship like between law enforcement officials, such as former FBI agents like yourself, Sheriff's Department, and attorneys, the prosecutor's office that have to then prosecute the crimes? How does that work?
It has to be a close relationship. And to Calabash's credit, what he did, he came in as a young assistant United States attorney. Then he became the United States Attorney, and one of his major traits was the ability to bring people together, to eliminate the turf wars, for example, between the FBI, the IRS, the DEA, the ATF, and local, county, and state police. And that's when, through his office, they started that task force, a drug task force in the early 80s, Prior to that, the DEA had sole federal jurisdiction over drugs. In 1983, Congress allowed the FBI to join the war on drugs, and the IRS in West Virginia in those days was the main investigative agency on drugs along with the state police, because the DEA didn't exist in Wheeling. The closest office, I think, was in Fairmont or Clarksburg. And so Calabash kind of put everybody together in the 80s. And doing that, we were able to put together a solid case against people like Hankish.
Well, in doing that, this joint drug task force, it does bring everyone together, and you were a part of that.
Yes.
And what was the role of your unit?
I was the rep, the FBI's rep, and I was responsible for deputizing all the local, county, and state police on the drug task force, because in those days the federal government would actually pay for their salaries, because the local departments really couldn't pay to peel people off on this special group without coming up with more money. And that's one thing the government did do back in those days and does continue to do somewhat these days. But today, a lot of the responsibility is thrust back onto the local departments.
One of the things you hear regularly from people that are living here in this area is that it's a great place to raise a family. And part of that's because of the low crime rate. And the efforts to knock out Hankish's group back in the 60s through the 80s that you were significantly involved in really did kind of put an end to organized crime in this area. It's kind of different now because of that, isn't it?
We were talking on the way up in the car today. Back in the 70s, for example, the FBI was involved in what they called interstate transportation of stolen property cases. And we had gangs in the northern panhandle. A lot of them were headed up by people like Hankish, who would target a lawyer or a doctor's home and end up stealing $100 or $200 or $300,000 worth of jewelry and coins. And within 3 days, that jewelry would be on sale in a jewelry shop on the East Coast, because these organized gangs had outlets for the property. Those kinds of gangs don't exist today. When was the last time you heard a major home invasion in even Hancock, Brook, Ohio, or Marshall County, where an affluent member of society had their goods stolen? It doesn't happen very often anymore. We have kind of a helter-skelter type of a criminal element today, rather than the organized groups that we used to have.
Now, because of that, it's changed. Organized crime isn't as much of an issue, but drugs still are. I mean, there's still drugs. What do you see in that regard?
And drugs change their face almost periodically. Early on, back in the 80s, marijuana was a big source of income for a lot of people. I mean, if you could sell a pound of marijuana for $2,000, and you could load up a pickup truck with a canvas with 100 pounds of marijuana in it, you were talking about almost $250,000. Then, of course, cocaine was prevalent, but crack came in the early 80s, and that changed the game again because it created so many addicted people. And now we've gone through all these other phases of drugs, and now it looks like the prescription, the pills are the problem today. They're being stolen, they're being forged. We have the medical community getting involved in it. You see doctors being indicted across the United States by state and federal governments because they're out for a quick dollar, some of them.
We have seen, even in the local press recently, the different pharmacies getting robbed, some of their entire inventory wiped out, things like that. Do you think that's something that will be a continuing trend?
I think it will. I mean, you had that case in Elm Grove where the gentleman was killed trying to rob the store, and his accomplice, his reported accomplice, was indicted recently on a charge. And then just on the day that the pharmacy was holding a Bring In Your Drug Day of old prescription pills that might be in your medicine cabinet, 2 men masked went in and spent an hour in that same pharmacy and stole over $50,000 worth of drugs. The average bank robbery in the old days netted somebody between $3,000 and $4,000. Now here's 2 guys going into a pharmacy walking away with $50,000.
I've noticed even just walking around some of the pharmacies that now they're security officers actually in the pharmacies, around the clock, which you didn't see before. But it's become a real issue, particularly here. I'm sure it's everywhere, but it's something that we haven't seen in the past, and we're now seeing it here in this area. And I know that it's a concern for those businesses. Of course, it's a concern for the customers and citizens.
We have a unique community, Jamie. I know when I first came here, I remember in the early 70s, the mayor of Wheeling was on national television. I forget her name offhand. She's passed away. But Wheeling was the safest city statistically in the United States. And we haven't fallen very far from that tree. Do we have more violent crime? Maybe we do. I think our local chief of police, our new chief, said the type of crime here was more violent than he experienced in the state of Virginia, the county he was in down there. We do have violent crime, as evidenced by the 2 young men who were just arrested in connection with allegedly being involved with the murder of that 92-year-old woman in Bel Air. I mean, those cases also existed in the old days. And I've just been affiliated with this cold case unit where a group of 9 people who are working on over 50 old cold case murder cases in the Valley. And I don't think we have that many these days.
We're going to take our first break. You're watching the Bordas Bordas Legal Review. When we return, we'll continue talking with former FBI agent and Ohio County Sheriff Tom Burgoyne. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Bordas Bordas Legal Review. I'm Jamie Bordas. We're talking today with Tom Burgoyne, former longtime FBI agent and Ohio County Sheriff, about his background in law enforcement and how it affects the things of today. Mr. Burgoyne, we are on a college campus today here at West Liberty, and there may be some students out there that are interested in going into law enforcement. Perhaps, how do I get into being an FBI agent or something else in law enforcement? What's the best route for them to take?
Well, I was very fortunate when I was young because the game changed a little bit. I was working in Washington, and at that time you had to have a degree and 3 years experience working for the FBI in a support capacity. And J. Edgar Hoover changed it to 2 years experience, and I was going to law school at Georgetown at night. But the only reason I was going to law school, Jamie, was not to become an attorney like you, was to get into the FBI, because that was the quickest way to get into the FBI back in those days, is to have your law degree or a degree in accounting. And my degree was in history from college. The game changed a lot. We have probably today we had 10,000 FBI agents when I retired in 96, and I think they're up to around 13,000. But this year, they're going to hire, I think, 400 people, and they've got over 25,000 applicants. So it's almost impossible to get in. And today they're looking for different kinds of people. Certainly they're looking for accountants, they're looking for lawyers. We used to have a lot of ex-football coaches come in who had a high school, they were teaching in high school, and they maybe had been former military people. And back in the 60s and 70s, we had a lot of former sports people, guys that were cut from various professional football teams or who wanted a career in law enforcement. But today, they're looking at the real smart people, the computer people, the engineers, the linguists. And of course, Arabic is a very big part of that today. In the old days, we used to use contractors sometimes with languages. And then we had the Spanish period for a time with all the big drug smuggling organizations. We had to have Spanish-speaking people. But today, the Arabic language is very important. We had a problem prior to 9/11 because we didn't have the human intelligence that we should have had, and we weren't sharing the information, as I talked before about with the task force sharing information. The FBI wasn't sharing with the CIA. Different national agencies were kind of protecting their sources of information, and they weren't sharing it the way they should have been. I think that has changed a lot today. And today's job with the FBI deals a lot with technology. They're looking to tap people's phones, put bugs into their homes. They have to have great solid evidence before they can do this, before they can go to a judge to get permission to do this kind of thing. So we really need a lot of people who are very, very intelligent in their fields. And that's why out of that 25,000, these 400 people, of course we have female agents today too. When I first started, we didn't have female agents. I don't think J. Edgar Hoover thought the female agents was a good thing, but trust me, we need female FBI agents, and a lot of them have risen to the top as far as being the agent in charge of major cities.
It's interesting that you mentioned professional athletes at some point, and back in the mid '90s, your parents were older and in poor health, and you transferred back up to Boston so you could be with your parents in their final years, and you got to actually have some interaction with some of the professional athletes during that time.
I did, and it was a fun year. In 1995, I was selected by the agent in charge of the Boston office to be the liaison person between, or among, all of the professional sports teams in Boston. The FBI nationwide selected an agent in all the major cities, one in New York, one in Detroit, one in Cleveland. Anywhere there was a major league or an NFL franchise or hockey or whatever, they took one agent and had him kind of get to know the players, so the players would have somebody they would trust in the event they had information regarding illegal gambling, illegal narcotics that might be impacting some of the players. To prohibit a Pete Rose situation from a gambling standpoint, Pete got in trouble with gambling, Darryl Strawberry, Dwight Gooden, even David Parker with the Pirates had problems with cocaine, and the franchises and the various leagues did not want this to happen again. And actually it was very interesting. So I spent a summer with the Boston Red Sox in Fenway Park. I can remember traveling on a train to New York to meet with the Knicks and the Celtics in a hotel room, talking to them about how they have to be careful because they can be taken advantage of. Some of these NBA players especially are walking corporations. They're 19, 20 years old, and they're multi-millionaires, and people like to take pictures of them in circumstances that they shouldn't be caught in. So they have to be very careful with their personal lives. And it was an interesting time. The only one person that really came to me with a problem was Rick Fox, who played basketball for North Carolina, went to the Celtics, and was dating a young woman. And her mother was a professor at either MIT or Harvard, and he wanted me to do a background investigation on the girl because, as he said, I'm going to be sharing millions of dollars with her. I'd like to know a little bit about her. I said, you're going to have to find out about that about yourself. You're going to have to hire a private investigator. The FBI is not going to do that. Well, he ultimately married her and ultimately had a child, and they were divorced, and then he got traded to the Los Angeles Lakers, and then you might remember he ended up marrying Vanessa Williams.
I do.
Yeah, former Miss America.
Yeah.
But he and I got fairly close because of that request, but he never got any information out of the FBI.
Well, along those same lines, with the you mentioned some of the players who've got involved with drugs. Dwight Gooden, Darryl Strawberry, David Parker. The fight against drugs is something that's been near and dear to your heart for a number of years, and now you're actually on the board of directors of an organization called Drug-Free Clubs of America, which is designed to combat the drug issue at an even younger age, at the high school level. What is the Drug-Free Clubs of America?
Well, actually, it came to Ohio County through the efforts of Gary and Flip West, who are very near and dear to the hearts of folks here at West Liberty. It's a group centered in Cincinnati, Ohio, run by two young ladies. One of the girls' dad started the company. He's a retired fireman, and they decided it would be nice to reward the kids in the high school for not getting involved with drugs. So they would allow themselves to be drug tested, mandatory drug tested at the beginning, and then throughout their high school career to be drug tested. And in return, they would get perks from the school and the community. For example, here in Wheeling, it started at Wheeling Central Catholic. Wheeling Park jumped on board big time, and they have a nice membership up there where the kids get rewarded. For example, DeCarlo's Pizza. The DeCarlos said if you show your card, your membership card to Drug-Free Clubs of America, if you buy a piece of pizza, you get one free. Same at the Dairy Queen. Ogilvy Park has offered a $20 or $25 gift card to these kids that they could come up here and use the card if they're a member of this organization. And I got involved in it only because they wanted somebody in Ohio County here to introduce them to the folks at Park and introduce them to the folks at Central Catholic. And now we're also working with several high schools within the OVAC. The OVAC has endorsed this organization. Magnolia High School, I understand, just last week, they did mandatory drug tests down there with the students who had signed up, and we have 120 members at Magnolia, and efforts are being underway currently to establish this at Madonna High School up in Weirton.
Now, as I understand it, they'll randomly drug test these kids, but the results don't go to the school. The school never finds out if a kid tests positive. It just goes to the parents, so the parents can know.
And that's one of the nice things about the program. And Wheeling Hospital has been a big partner with us here in Ohio County because they do the drug testing for free. Now that's a big thing for this company to have an agency like that do the test. So the girls will come into the school, take the test, Wheeling Hospital examines the specimen. And it's really working out well. But like you said, the high school doesn't get involved from a liability standpoint because they don't even know about it. All they know is that the company says, have John Smith surrender his drug-free card. Now, they know something's happened when the student has to surrender his card, but they're never told by the hospital that this youngster has tested positive. The test goes directly to the parent, and then Drug Free Clubs of America sets up a counseling program that the child can attend once he's been found to be testing positive.
And I guess the idea of the program is instead of punishing kids that use drugs is to kind of reward kids that are staying clean.
Exactly.
And to give them some type of incentive to not start using drugs.
Right. It's a reverse peer pressure technique, which seems to be working real well.
And I guess one of the goals is to not only, as you said, you've gotten now into New Martinsville at Magnolia High School, Madonna up in Weirton, but also now the goal is to ultimately spread it throughout the state of West Virginia.
Right, and the state legislature has looked at this. I know the governor's office is aware of this. The problem is it costs about $65 per child to make this program work. And in Wheeling, we're lucky enough to have Gary and Flip West, who have offered to pay $45 of the $65, and the other $20 comes from either the school or the parent. With Magnolia, they're trying to find local businessmen who will support this as well. Same in Weirton.
Well, it's a wonderful cause. Kids get into drugs. It affects every area of their life, whether it be academically, whether they're listening to their parents, athletically, of course, affects performance. So it is a big issue, and it's one that hopefully we can all work toward fighting.
And I think it takes the whole community to attack that problem.
It does, and that's one of the great things about living here in the Ohio Valley is that I think people do take a vested interest in the community so that they want to help each other. The teachers want to help the students, help the parents, and if everybody can work together, we can work toward this together.
And education's the big key there. You notice down in Wetzel County, they recently had what they call a drug roundup down there, where they I think indicted Prosecutor Hott down there indicted I think 25 kids, young adults.
Yeah.
Maybe one person was in their 50s. But 17, I think, out of the 25 had never finished high school. And that speaks for itself.
Well, we're out of time today, but I really appreciate you coming on the show and telling us a little bit about your career in law enforcement and some of your involvement here with the Drug Free Clubs of America. Thank you for watching the Bordas and Bordas Legal Review today. We've been speaking with Tom Burgoyne about his FBI career, his career as an Ohio County Sheriff. Join us again next week for another episode of the Bordas and Bordas Legal Review.